we have shown that it is underlying social conditions that really affect who is vulnerable to climate change and why they're vulnerable to climate change. So if we take the example of heat waves, it's elderly people who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But when we look, we see that is if people are socially marginalized, if they're isolated, if they live alone, then they're much more likely to have significant impacts, including, in fact, who lives or dies through heat waves. And if we have looked in Bangladesh, for example, at how people cope with weather-related hazards in cities, and we see that people really help each other. They can deal with these impacts of climate change and reduce their vulnerability by helping each other during floods, by banding together, having credit unions, helping each other economically through these hard times. So it is these underlying social conditions that really shape who is vulnerable to climate change. Our work has shown that it's social marginalization and people at the periphery of society who are most vulnerable to climate change. This might be the elderly because of the risks of heat wave, but it also is people who are poor, people who live in marginalized places who are much more exposed and have much less ability and capacity to adapt to these impacts of climate change. It is these conditions that really drive vulnerability. People move all the time throughout the world because they see better opportunities in another place. Still, the most dominant flow of migrants is from rural areas to cities globally. And it is these sorts of flows that are being amplified by climate change because it is making the places they live much less attractive and the towns and cities where they're moving to more attractive. But one of the other great risks is people not being mobile enough, being trapped in places that are hazardous to the impacts of climate change, and they need to be facilitated and helped to actually move and migrate. I think cities are the crucibles for climate change adaptation because people are moving there and because the risks of climate change are really amplified there. So we need to make cities plan for climate change, help them to plan for climate change, and make them much more safe, sustainable, and resilient. Secondly, we need to work with nature to make sure that our green spaces help us to adapt to climate change and that we realign our coasts and work with nature in adapting to all ecosystems to climate change. And thirdly, we really need to see climate change as a risk to the places that we live and the places that we love and things that we really care about. And also, we have shown that doing this and framing it as a matter for ourselves and for a matter of collective public health is something that gives us hope for the future and gives us the incentive to deal with climate change as it comes down the track.